The Gentile area was probably one of the worst places actually to worship. But the Jews treat it like that because they didn't consider that area, that court area of the Gentiles, to be as significant as their area. Welcome back to the Sabbath School lesson, everyone. This is lesson number 5, horizontal atonement, the cross, and the church. I think I got that all right. It's kind of a lot to remember on that line. This is a really good lesson for this week, so let's go ahead and dive right into the memory verse. Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 13 and 14, it says, "But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ, for he himself is our peace, who has made us both one." Okay, so the author gets into a little bit of imagery for this lesson this week, and it's really important to understand something, so I'm going to add in a little bit of extra details here. But basically, he gives you the imagery of a Gentile who's now coming over to Jerusalem, likely maybe for, the Passover time. And basically, as he walks into the Jerusalem area and he starts to enter the outer courts, he ends up seeing a sign that's there and a barricade saying that foreigners cannot go beyond this point. And if you try to go beyond that point, they're going to kill you, basically. And there's an idea here that's left in the Gentiles' mind that as much as they would want to convert to Christ, as much as they would want to be, a child of God, they can only get so close to God. They're never truly good enough to be like the Jews, because the Jews got to go in further into the courts. Now, it's important to understand this. There were 4 different courts in Jesus' day. There was the court of the Gentiles, the court of the women, the court of the men, and the court of the priests, right? So you got Gentiles, women, men, and then the priest. The priest and the men's court were the closest courts to kind of the holy place, or the most holy place that you can essentially find. Now, and then the outer courts are likely going to be the women, and then the furthest out court is going to be the Gentiles. So just have that in the back of your mind. The Gentiles were essentially the farthest away from God. And this was a big kind of problem for the Gentiles because they never truly felt like they were good enough for Christ, or at least for God, right? You come to worship in the Jerusalem temple because you convert, and all of a sudden it seems like because you're not a Jew, because you were born to this family over here, you never can come that close to God. And that's the way many of them felt. Paul utilizes that imagery when he's talking to them and says, hey, those of you that were far off have been brought near. He's talking about the Gentiles who were far off in the temple courts. They weren't able to come near like the Jews. And so what Paul's point is, Christ took you and essentially placed you in the area that the Jews are standing, near, close to God. In other words, you are now good enough to be like the Jews because of what Christ did for you. The second point that you want to see here comes from Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 14 and 15. And it says, "For he himself is our peace, who made both groups into one and broke down the barrier of the dividing wall by abolishing in his flesh the enmity, which is the law of commandments contained in ordinances, so that in himself he might make the two into one new man, thus establishing peace." Jesus is our symbol of peace. He now cut down the dividing wall between us and God. If you remember very briefly, I said that the Jews and the Gentiles were separate in different courts. And essentially there's a dividing wall kind of between them. There's a area or a barrier, right? The Gentiles were far off, and now they've been brought near with Christ. Christ broke down the barrier between the Jews and the Gentiles. He also broke down the barrier between the Jews and also God himself. So the Jews couldn't just enter the most holy place. Only the high priest could do that. But Christ broke down that wall between God and humanity. And he broke down the wall between Jews and Gentiles. So essentially, everyone can now come together as one. And that's the point that the author's trying to bring out in this lesson. So number one, just remember that essentially where you were without Christ, because if you don't remember where you were without Christ, then you're not going to be able to appreciate what Christ does for you. That's Paul's first point. Number two, he wants you to remember that Jesus is our symbol of peace, and there's nothing that we have done to save ourselves. Now let's move on to the profound meditation. Okay, so for the profound meditation, I want you to see something really interesting, and this is actually pretty cool. Remember 4 courts? So court of the Gentiles, the court of the women, court of the men, and the court of the priest, right? And by the way, don't mind if I'm like swatting because now mosquitoes are attacking me. So, but anyways, this is really important. So hopefully you get this. The idea here that you end up finding is that Jesus ends up coming into the story in a couple different times. You end up finding that he comes into the temple and he starts turning over the money changers. And he's like, get this out of here. My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. And you've made it a den of thieves and lions, or not lions, thieves. And so basically Jesus comes in here and causes mayhem in the temple. He didn't cause mayhem. Mayhem was already happening. He was basically putting it back to what it should have been. But understand this scene. Now, what most people don't realize is scenes like that would have likely taken place in the outer courts. And when I mean the outer courts, I'm talking about the court of the Gentiles. What's interesting is Gentiles came from long distances away. Many Jews did too. But when they came, they didn't carry their lamb offering with them because it was such a long distance. So they likely would just get there and they would buy it right there around the temple area. Well, where essentially was it set up for them to buy? Remember, they couldn't go that close to the temple. It was set up to buy in their own area where they worship. So where they came to worship, they also ended up bringing out all this, lambs and other stuff like that, different things for them to essentially buy as offerings. So it was very loud and flamboyant. The Gentile area was probably one of the worst places actually to worship. But the Jews treat it like that because they didn't consider that area, that court area of the Gentiles, to be as significant as their area. They wouldn't do the same thing in their courthouse, right? Or in their area, the court of the men or the court of the priests. You wouldn't see stuff like this going crazy like that. But in the court of the Gentiles, sure, the Spirit of God is there, but they're least significant. And so because they're least significant, we're going to treat it that way. And Jesus goes crazy and says, get this out of here. And he essentially is trying to help people understand that just because you think a Gentile is insignificant doesn't mean that God isn't actually there. Right? It's still his temple. Just because it's in the outer courts doesn't mean it's not in the temple area. This is where the presence of God is. They wouldn't do that in their own area, but they'll do all this reckless business inside of the court of the Gentiles. And so this was a huge, huge point that Christ is essentially making to help people understand that just because you're in the area where the Gentiles worship, that doesn't mean that the Spirit of God isn't there. This is still the Spirit of God's temple. Now, Paul makes a really good point about this because Paul says the temple of God is you, right? You are the temple of God. And many of us tend to have this mindset that we are insignificant. There are certain things about us that are really insignificant. The things we do, our successes, perhaps it's our relationship, the things we say, or even a job that we're at. We go on a job and we're like, man, we're just doing stuff that's insignificant. We're not doing anything important. But what we don't realize is that because you are the temple of God, God dwells in all areas of his temple. It doesn't matter if you think a part of his temple is essentially insignificant. God dwells there. And God dwells in all parts of you. It doesn't matter if you think a part of your life or something that you do is insignificant. You are the temple of God. It doesn't matter whether it's your inner court of your mind or it's something a little bit further out. It doesn't matter. Because you are the temple of God, God dwells wherever you go and whatever you do. So the things you think are insignificant about yourself still are significant to God because you are his temple. The thing you think is insignificant about yourself is where the presence of God is because you are God's temple. The thing you think is insignificant about yourself is where the presence of God is because you are God's temple. And that, my friend, is a profound meditation. I'm Oswald, and this is Profound Meditations Sabbath School Summary.